This is a holistic approach that no drug will ever come close to. These are the non-negotiables of our physiology. If you're bypassing these fundamental steps and going straight for the medication or the supplement, you are not going to reach your peak health and performance.
You need stress in your life. You heard me right. You need stress in your life. I'm Dr. David Perlmutter. Welcome again to the Empowering Neurologist. That might sound paradoxical, but in reality, having a level of stress in your life is actually good. We're going to be looking at a new book today called The Stress Paradox. Let me read the subtitle to you. Why You Need Stress, Who Knew? To Live Longer, Healthier, and Happier. Sharon Bergquist, MD, is our guest. This is a fascinating book, and I think it's going to really shake you up a little bit in terms of what you think you should be doing. Let me tell you a little bit more about our guest today. Sharon Bergquist, MD, is an award-winning physician, innovative healthcare leader, and visionary researcher renowned for spearheading a science-based approach to applying lifestyle as medicine. She's helped lead numerous clinical trials, including the Emory Healthy Aging Study and the NIH-funded Emory Healthy Brain Study. She's widely published in peer-reviewed journals and has contributed to over 200 news segments, including segments that have appeared on Good Morning America, CNN, ABC News, The Wall Street Journal, and NPR. She hosts the Whole Health Cure podcast, and her very popular TED Ed video on how stress affects the body has been viewed over 6 million times. She's been educated at both Yale and Harvard Medical School as well. I'm very excited to welcome her to the program. Let's get right to it. Well, hello, Dr. Bergquist. Welcome to our program.
It's an absolute pleasure to be here.
You know, we've all talked about stress management, and stress has always been a bad thing. You know, Herb Benson made that very clear so many years ago. Candace Pert, Molecules of Emotion. And, you know, certainly part of my messaging and probably part of yours over many years has been, you know, you got to eat right, you got to exercise, and you have to manage stress. Now you write a book that's basically telling us that, well, hold on a little bit. There might be an upside to being a little bit stressed. So how did this shift kind of in perspective happen to you?
Yeah, so I was part of the group that was speaking the language that stress is harmful. In fact, the early part of my career, I was one of those people talking about how stress harms. I actually did a TED Ed video that went through all the different organ systems that are affected by stress. And interestingly enough, the biggest comment I ever got back from that is that I'm getting stressed about stress. And I think what led me to the science of good stress, so a different kind of stress, is where I came at it through my career. So my career, I've been in practice now for 25 years in internal medicine, and my practice is largely based on how do we implement lifestyle medicine tools to prevent, manage, and reverse disease and help people age healthy. And there are many reasons behind that pivot. It came kind of at an early stage in my career, largely driven by the fact that I felt I could be doing more for my patients and I could be rethinking medicine. And along that journey, the process of good stress has really become apparent to me as one of the most powerful levers we have for maintaining health and slowing the aging process. Because if we are looking at the pathways and processes that are leading to the chronic diseases, the accelerated aging, our mental health, the furthest upstream we can go is to the level of our cells, right? Our symptoms, our body systems, our health, disease processes really come down to what is happening in our cells. Are our cells being impaired, and how are they being impaired? And the resounding answer is yes. I mean, that is what symptoms are, and that is what leads to disease. But good stress, these hormetic stressors, are helping our cells get healthier. And to me, this is the most fundamental way to approach our health, right? Our cells are the basic building blocks in our body. We have over 30 trillion. And if we can make our cells healthy, we are on a path towards living a life with joy, not experiencing the common symptoms that modern medicine doesn't really have good answers for. We are building our defenses against disease. And that's what led me down the path towards good stress, these hormetic stressors, because they are simply the best medicine.
I have to say that what you just described is such a common theme amongst clinicians that I have on the program that, suddenly at a point in their career, there was a bit of an epiphany of realizing that there could be more that they could be doing as opposed to simply following a standard doctrine in terms of patient intervention to really unpack a little bit of what's going on behind the curtain in terms of why people are getting ill. And what you're describing here is really tapping into a system that is already there, and it just needs to be utilized. I mean, it's the reason we exercise. Everybody, I think, understands that by stressing your muscles, they become stronger and more resilient and more protective. But what you describe in your book is really, in a good way, a hormetic way, stressing systems throughout the body. And I want to start with a couple of areas that are a little bit challenging for me. And first would be sleep. How is, we always talk about the fundamental need for restorative sleep in terms of its quality and quantity. And having said that, is there a place for our discussion on the benefits of stress or disrupting habits in regards to sleep that might be beneficial?
Yeah, so hormetic stressors, for people who are not familiar, they're mild to moderate stressors that are brief and intermittent, followed by recovery. And that's very different from the chronic stressors that we're used to, which are continuous stressors that are always there in some low grade way. So, good stress are things like high intensity interval training. Bad stress would be things like financial hardship, difficult relationship, things that are more chronic. And one of the fundamental ways that good stress benefits us is this recovery piece. So, the sleep is critical. So it's during stress when we put ourselves, for example, through a resistance training or a high intensity interval workout, using exercise as a familiar example. What our bodies do in that stress situation is that they turn on their housekeeping functions. We are repairing cells, we are turning over cells through the process of autophagy, and we're making ourselves more efficient so that the next time our body handles stress, we're better prepared. But it's in the recovery from the stress that our body does the rewiring, the remodeling, the reconfiguring so that we can get to a more resilient state. If you just go through the stress without the recovery, you're essentially building chronic stress. Any good stress can become harmful if it's not intermittent.
So I would say that for our viewers, that your description, brief, intermittent, and followed by recovery, brief, intermittent, and followed by recovery, as opposed to this chronic smoldering background stress slash inflammation from which there really never is a recovery. So you don't really get a benefit from that sort of ongoing emotional, physical, environmental kind of stress that really sort of typifies our modern life.
Absolutely. So the process of becoming more resilient through stress is stress, recover, repeat. Stress, recover, repeat. And that's the blueprint that I think we can follow.
And it's the repeat part. You're on your way home from the gym, knowing darn well I've got to come back tomorrow. It never finishes. Let me ask you then, as we look at comparing our modern worlds, not just the threats of our environments, but more even along the lines of our sedentarity and along the lines of our circadian rhythms, et cetera. It seems as if the perfect match with environment and evolution would be described by our Paleolithic ancestors who had some degree of stress. So, how does our current environment stack up against the environment of our ancestors in terms of the relationship to the hormetic good type of stress that you describe?
There are echoes of paleo, but there are also some ways that a hormetic approach are different. Our ancestors grew up were in an environment essentially that had hormetic stress as a natural part of the environment. And the hormetic stressors, to give examples of what we're talking about, are plant chemicals, the phytochemicals, intervals of intense exercise. So, young or old, everybody had to endure that. Periods of food scarcity, thermal stress, heat and cold, and some mental and emotional challenges, right? They had to always think of, how do I move beyond the horizon? How do I build new tools? Those challenges were built into a way of life. And in the last 2 to 3 centuries, we've had radical changes in our culture where we've introduced a lot of technology and comfort. And a lot of that has been good. My goodness, like, we are not dying of starvation. We are not dying of injury. I mean, these are ways we have progressed, but there's been a price that we've paid as part of that comfort because we have taken out of the fabric of our lives these stressors that our entire physiology has grown to adapt to and require for us to reach our highest state of health because they activate our natural healing ability. The way this is a little different than paleo, though, is that we're not exactly trying to recreate the life of our ancestors, right? The challenge with that is there's more than one Paleolithic lifestyle, right? Depending on where people live. Were they close to water? Could they access fish? Could they get salty food? The Paleolithic diets and lifestyles varied. And at the end of the day, our genes are selected for survival. They're not selected for health. So, not all Paleolithic things contribute to our health, and not all modern day things are necessarily harmful to our health. What's amazing about the time that we are living in is we have the molecular and cellular technologies to understand what specific habits from our Paleolithic ancestors are the ones that activate our genes in a way that promotes health, and what doesn't, right? So this is Paleo 2.0 essentially, using modern technology. And the incredible common theme is that these hormetic stressors activate a gene program that has been conserved and handed down for generations. Vitagenes are about 500 genes. And when nature conserves something, as you know, it's telling us this is super important. They encode our ability to ramp up our antioxidant defenses or inflammatory defenses. It's within these genes that we have our cellular stress responses that are the ones that build our defenses.
I think that we've seen examples of that. Resveratrol targeting the sirtuin pathway, et cetera. But what are some common toxins? And I don't mean environmental chemicals that we're exposed to, but plant-based toxins that are, on the one hand, somewhat threatening to us, but actually activate these hormetic pathways that we commonly consume.
What you're bringing up is this fascinating rethinking of our relationship to food and our natural environment. The way we typically think of food is that if I eat a blueberry, I'm going to get the antioxidants from the blueberries. That the more I eat, the more antioxidants I get. But what's really happening is it's a different process. The reason the blueberry has phytochemicals, plant chemicals, is because plants make them in response to stressors in their environment: drought, ultraviolet light, insects, humans like you and I chomping on them. And that stress resistance is what is stored in the phytochemical. When we as humans consume the phytochemical, it activates our stress responses. So resveratrol, as you mentioned, activates our sirtuin response. It helps us build mitochondria. It also helps DNA and a lot of other functions. Sulforaphane is another plant chemical in broccoli and cruciferous vegetables. It activates a master regulator called NRF2, which increases our antioxidant and detoxification systems. We have allicin, which is another phytochemical in garlic and onions and leek, and it opens pores that allow calcium in that stimulates growth factors like brain-derived neurotrophic factor. So in the book, I mentioned 10 that are really well studied for their hormetic ability. But the key here is that we need the food to activate our innate ability to defend against disease. And it's our own endogenous ability that depends on these plants.
What you're describing is this really incredible relationship that we have with the plant world. That these phytoalexins that they develop to protect themselves against various threats, ultraviolet light being consumed by other animals, fungal invasion, etc. That the chemicals that they have learned how or created over their evolution, we are able to harvest those benefits into our physiology. And interestingly, there's some discussion that we like to think, for example, of polyphenols as being nurturing for our microbiome and antioxidant in and of themselves. But there's some discussion now that polyphenols might act because they actually threaten our mitochondria, and in so doing, we are able to offset that threat, representing a bit of a hormetic stress, offset it, and then gain a little back through mitochondrial biogenesis, the formation of new mitochondria. So it becomes a little bit more nuanced and complicated to think this through, as opposed to, hey, I'm going to eat more blueberries, A, because they taste good and they've got fructose, and B, I've heard that they're good for me, but they're actually, in a sense, it plays right into your hand that it's a low level threat to our physiology from which we respond in a positive way ultimately.
That's right. So essentially, when the plant is making the phytochemical, it's a natural pesticide, it's a toxin. And over years, as our ancestors had to learn to consume different types of edible foods, right? The more that they could eat, the longer and better they could survive. So they had to learn to detoxify and essentially build their resistance against potentially poisonous toxins in these plants. And it acts as a toxin in our body. And that is what's stressing our body to turn on these gene programs that are building our stress resistance.
It's always breathtaking to consider this relationship, and we tend to visualize ourselves as fairly autonomous and creating food. We have this notion of ultra processed food, which to me sounds like the most obvious oxymoron of all times, because it totally disregards the relationship that you just described. And I think that as we talk about ultra processed foods, people talk about what is the threat. Well, you don't get fiber, they're higher in omega-6, they're going to raise your blood glucose and increase insulin resistance, but they are at the very core of completely disregarding this incredible relationship that you just described.
And that's true of all these hermetic stressors. So the key thing for people to know is that lack of these stressors are making us more vulnerable to disease. It is one of the biggest risk factors we are currently facing, right? We think of risk factors as the processed foods, as the things that are in our environment that we need to avoid, right? Every message that we get is avoid processed food, avoid being sedentary, avoid chronic stress. It creates this mindset of fear of all of these restrictions and how are we going to, learn to manage all of these. What we're doing with hormetic stress is the other side of the equation. We are building our defenses. And if we don't do it, we're going to be out of balance in the harms that are inherent in our modern world. So on any given day, you're going to have 10,000 injuries to your DNA, right? 7 a minute, which is profound. And our body in the background basal level has a DNA repair response, and it's constantly trying to repair. The stressors we're talking about activate the DNA repair response. But if we're incurring injury at a faster rate than what we can repair, we are tilting the balance towards disease, premature aging, higher rate of symptoms. And by reinstituting these good stressors, these intermittent brief stressors, we are building the defense. We're increasing our resistance and reestablishing a balance so that we can survive in our modern world, but with a mindset of empowerment and growth, not just fear and avoidance.
This is so good. I mean, I'm sure that our viewers right now are just enjoying every bit of this because we all know, well, we should exercise. Maybe there's some people who do some cold plunging, getting in the sauna, intermittent fasting. That's a common term these days. But to really unpack the why here, and which is what we're doing, I think it makes it much more meaningful and much more compelling to engage what you and I will now talk about moving forward. Well, hi, everyone. Dr. David Perlmutter here. We hope you're enjoying this content. And if you would do so, go ahead and hit the like button. And if you're not already a subscriber to our channel, please consider doing so. We're really grateful to have you as part of our community. So let's get right back to the presentation. So let's first start with exercise. We've known for a long time that, well, when you stress a muscle fiber or a body of muscle, that you're traumatizing it and it repairs itself and then a little bit more, i.e., muscle might hypertrophy a little bit and you'll gain a little bit. I think it's a pretty good metaphor for what may be going on throughout the body through the action of other hormetic stressors. But let's first talk about the stress of whatever exercise endeavor one would choose.
And the first thing I'll say is viewing exercise as a stress is in itself a little different from the way that we typically think of stress. But stress, in a technical sense, is anything that challenges your mental or physical capacity. And one of the most fascinating parts of understanding our stress responses is exactly what you just mentioned, that when we recover from stress, we actually don't go back to quote normal or to the state we were at the start. We either gain resilience in the case of building muscle, that's exactly what's happening, or we lose resilience. The good stressors, again, are these ones that are gaining resilience. So in the case of strength resistance, it's what you just mentioned. We can see our muscles, we're stronger. The other types of exercise that are building our resilience are also aerobic. And the reason the aerobic piece is so critical is because cardiorespiratory fitness or our aerobic fitness is the single biggest predictor of our longevity and our risk of developing disease. And in order to build cardiorespiratory fitness, there's clearly an advantage to have intermittent spikes of vigorous activity. If you look at clinical studies of people who only do moderate intensity exercise, so they're following the physical activity guidelines, you can either do 150 minutes of exercise or 75 minutes of vigorous or some combination. But the people who do it through moderate intensity, a brisk walk, which is probably the most common form of exercise, about 40% of people are non-responders to increasing their cardiorespiratory fitness. And as a general rule, you need the stronger the stimulus, the stress stimulus, the more you trigger adaptation.
This is important information. What I think we need to just linger here a little bit longer, and that is that going for your 5 mile walk and listening to a podcast is all well and good, but in terms of really gaining the benefit of an exercise program, there's got to be you've got to push yourself for a given period of time, even if it's intermittently, in terms of your heart rate and your respiratory rate. And so that's where you're really going to gain the advantage.
And that is such an important piece because physical activity guidelines don't take into account cardiorespiratory fitness. And then there are about 9,000 studies on cardiorespiratory fitness. We know it's important. It simply hasn't made it to guidelines. It hasn't made it into healthcare of how most physicians counsel their patients. But this is such a key part of making ourselves able to live a long, healthy life. But it doesn't have to be difficult. You can take any activity you like and do it in intervals. For example, if you do like walking, walk in intervals. So there was a study done in Japan in older
It's the
adults.
delta. Understood.
Yeah. Yeah. Where the one group just walked continuously. Another group was told walk 3 minutes really fast and then just back off, catch your breaths, walk slow for 3 minutes, and then do it again in intervals, same duration of physical activity. And as they followed them, I believe the study was for a month or maybe it was 3 months. But the group that did the interval walking developed a higher cardiorespiratory fitness and greater reduction in their cardiometabolic risk factors. So,
Do you have a sense as to why?
um, my sense is again, the stronger the stimulus, the greater the adaptation to push our body to develop cardiorespiratory fitness. What do we need to do? We need a stronger heart to pump blood. We need lungs that can breathe better air. We need blood vessels that are plump and can deliver the blood. And we need mitochondria.
There we
And
go.
that is the bingo, the critical piece. If we rapidly deplete our energy reserves, we are sending a strong signal to our body to increase mitochondrial biogenesis, so create new mitochondria, and we're also stimulating mitophagy, which is a selective form of autophagy that takes our damaged mitochondria and helps through a process of fission and fusion to make them healthier. So essentially, we are generating more energy and cleaner energy. And that's what you want in your body. Like you want good, clean energy.
There's a lot written about, and certainly I've been messaging this for a very long time about the relationship of decreased risk for Alzheimer's related to increased exercise. The more you exercise, it seems up to a point, you can overdo it, but it is a powerful inroad in terms of decreasing Alzheimer's risk. And what the messaging has always been is that there are myokines, including BDNF, inosine, cathepsin D, irisin, IL-6, et cetera, that are ultimately positive in terms of acting as supportive elements in the brain. But I think what you just described in terms of the mitochondrial benefit from exercise, from stressing, from a cardiovascular perspective, has huge role to play, not only obviously in brain health, but throughout the body, and through the relationship of metabolic health now to immunological health in an area that we now described as immunometabolism. I think regulating mitochondrial function, therefore, or enhancing mitochondrial function even through exercise, is the reason that there's a decreased risk for cancer and other immunological issues related to the amount of exercise and the type of exercise that we get. So I think the mitochondrial connection is huge.
I think mitochondria play an outsized role in everything we're talking about disease prevention, in slowing the hallmarks of aging and the processes that lead to aging. And and exercise is the most potent way to increase the health of our mitochondria. We are doing it with all the other stressors. So with the plant toxins, different forms of intermittent fasting, all improve our mitochondrial health. But the most potent is clearly the exercise piece. And it makes sense if you think about it because our cells need energy. If our cells cannot efficiently create energy, they cannot do the repair, the growth processes. They can't do their basic function. They're impaired if the mitochondria is impaired. So one way to think about it is if your cells are coming off an assembly line and the mitochondria are the batteries. If every battery that's in the cell is defective, then every place you put that cell, you're going to have a defective battery. So when you put that cell in a body system, be it a brain system, well, your neurons are impaired. You can't think as effectively. Your mood is going to be altered. If you put that cell in the heart, it's going to reduce your cardiac capacity and on and on. So the mitochondria definitely play such a critical role in our learning of the role of mitochondria in our body is changing dramatically. Like when I was in high school, every cell in that biology textbook had one mitochondria. and,
That's right.
and what we know now,
Except for the erythrocyte, of course.
yeah, and we know now that you can have thousands in one cell. And our mitochondria are the communication hubs in our body. They are communicating to each other. And they are creating this kind of life force, this chi that is just cross-talking throughout our body. Our mitochondria are regulating our circadian biology. It seems that they're the central hub talking to our immune system. It's really just profound how many systems are impacted by the health of our mitochondria.
Um, this is your interview, but what I'm thinking about right now is something I was studying last night, and let me just go through this because I think it's just breathtaking. That there are some genetic risk factors or predisposing risk factors for Parkinson's that are related to the microglial cell's ability to form microtubules to share mitochondria with those other microglial cells, the brain's immune system cells, in which the mitochondria may be not working as effectively. That these microglial cells can come to the aid of another microglial cell in whom the mitochondria is not working effectively and share mitochondria via these microtubules, and a deficiency in their ability to share mitochondria is related to familial Parkinson's disease. Was that too much, or was
No,
that all right?
that is profound.
It is. You know, when you read a fact like that, especially at night, and then you're falling back on your pillow thinking about all this is going on. You know, there's evidence that mitochondria travel throughout the entire body and go around to assist themselves when their brethren are in trouble. I mean, we're just beginning to get that. And to get back to immune functionality as represented by in the brain the microglial cells, in the body the macrophages, fully dependent on metabolism, i.e., mitochondrial function. So it makes it very clear that therapies to enhance mitochondrial function have an immune play, have an anti-aging play, have a longevity play. So where I wanted to take our conversation then is you're talking about the value of exercise then as a bit of a mitochondrial hormetic challenge, and then we get the digestion away of defective mitochondria, mitophagy, and the growth of new mitochondria, mitochondrial biogenesis. But that said, there seems to be a move these days to do this chemically, vis-a-vis rapamycin, metformin, and other pathways that seem to initiate this kind of stress for a better outcome. How do you see that? How can you comment on that?
Yeah, and I'm going to say that what I'm going to say right now is going to extrapolate to all medications and all supplements. When you are targeting one pathway, so NAD, sirtuin pathway, or you pick metformin, AMPK pathway,
Or
whichever,
take GLP-1, may as well.
all drugs, you're targeting one pathway. When you are using your lifestyle, you are reversing all of the pathways that are contributing to the disease. This is a holistic approach that no drug will ever come close to. These are the non-negotiables of our physiology. If you're bypassing these fundamental steps and going straight for the medication or the supplement, you are not going to reach your peak health and performance.
So much is written and certainly popular these days to expose ourselves to heat and cold. Is there ultimately a difference? I know we used to say heat shock protein was induced by heat exposure. Now I think there's a move to call it thermal shock protein. But is there a difference between those two extremes?
There are commonalities, and then, of course, there are differences in our biological response to both of them. What cold and heat have in common is they're stressors. Again, they're stressing our body because they're changing our core body temperature. Our body wants to be at 98.7 degrees Fahrenheit. That is the temperature where our enzymes work optimally. And that's so critical that our body's going to defend that. When we're exposed to cold, our core body temperature is going to lower. When we're exposed to heat, it's going to go higher. And we have natural feedback mechanisms that try and reestablish the homeostasis, the back to the 98.7, so that we can continue to survive. That response to the stress is what's activating our stress responses. So the similarity is that both of them are going to trigger these cellular defense mechanisms that we're talking about, helping our mitochondria through the sirtuin response or antioxidant regulatory response. Or besides that, we also have the autophagy response. Heat shock proteins are part of that. So both of them are activating the cellular piece. How they work in our body physiologically, which is a slightly different level in terms of the impact they're having on our hormone levels, our neurotransmitters. There are some differences. They both are going to raise metabolism. One, in the cold, we're doing it to generate heat. With exposure to heat, we're raising our metabolism essentially to get rid of heat, to dissipate the heat. But in the process of what our body's doing, we're going to have slightly different outcomes physiologically. What I mean by that is, for example, exercise, or I should say heat mimics exercise. When we're exposed to heat, our body wants to get rid of the heat. So it's going to dilate our blood vessels, get more blood to the periphery so that we can evaporate the heat off of our body. We mimic exercise, moderate to vigorous exercise, because our heart rate and our cardiac output goes up to the same degree as exercise. That's going to create shear stress in our arteries. So we have 60,000 feet of endothelium that lines our arteries. And when that shear stress goes across the lining of our arteries, it increases our production of nitric oxide. And nitric oxide dilates our blood vessels. It prevents our platelets from clumping. It reduces the risk of cholesterol plaques building. And it's a fairly unique benefit of heat exposure, which is a little different than cold exposure. With cold exposure, there are benefits from increasing brown fat and from shivering that we can get into. So what it's doing at a physiologic level is different, but the commonality with the reason people should be doing these practices comes back down to our goal is to prevent disease at an earlier stage or to manage and possibly reverse the disease. I mean, that's ultimately why we do any health habit. And by trying to make our cells healthier, in this case, the endothelial cells, the lining of our blood vessels, we are going as far upstream as possible to get to the root cause of what is causing the heart disease, what is causing the changes in our metabolic health that are making us unhealthy. So this is such a holistic root cause way of focusing on what you should be doing to be healthy in our modern world. And so much, and I say this because so much of the attention on cold and heat is kind of viewed as a very biohacker thing to do. And for people who are really into ultra longevity, what I want people to understand is that this is an everyday thing that every person should be doing. These are ways that we have lost the connection to what our genes need, what our bodies need to thrive, to ramp up our ability to heal. And when we're removing the kind of the basis of what our bodies need, and we're letting our culture drive what we're doing as habits, we are just on the wrong track of supporting our body to essentially live the long, healthy life that we all want.
I was watching a program on television yesterday, and there was an ad, and the ad came on for a certain brand of shoe that I won't say, and it said, "This shoe, you don't have to bend over to put it on. You can just slide your foot in." That's a big thing now. God forbid you would have to bend over to put your shoes on. And so, it's just a commentary that we're becoming just so soft. It just life becomes so easy and comfortable, and sedentarity is the smoking of our times. I think, to me, a recurrent theme in our conversation is the idea of change. Of that, the change is what really is good for us. The change of temperature, the change of exercising versus not exercising, and taking that to an aggressive level, i.e., a higher intensity, the change of suddenly being without food. In other words, more of a time restricted program, or even fasting. And that's really the initiator. That's really what seems to promulgate these positive downstream um, um, chemical messages that ultimately have properties whereby they stimulate the very activity you're talking about, the growth of higher levels of good mitochondria versus poor, clearing out cellular debris, leading to hypertrophy of muscle, stimulating growth of new brain cells, neurogenesis, synaptogenesis, on and on. But it's really the delta, it's really the change that we volitionally institute. I think our amygdala would like us to sit in the couch and watch TV, but our prefrontal cortex is saying, yep, that's not going to cut it. We need you to get up, get off the couch now. And whether you like it or not, you've got to let your body experience a change in your environment. So it's interesting. It's kind of a theme throughout everything related to your new book. And, for me, the lesson was as it relates to something called hyperbaric oxygen therapy, which is something I've been involved with for probably 28 years. And to me, it was, well, we're powering my mitochondria by giving more oxygen under pressure. So we were putting people in hyperbaric chambers at 100% oxygen. Normally, the air we breathe is 21% oxygen. So amping up the oxygen, putting under pressure, driving that oxygen into every tissue in the body, thinking this is a really good thing. And it was to some degree, but it turns out, back to the discussion of change, that it wasn't just the idea of loading the body with oxygen, it was the delta. It was the drop in oxygenation from the 100% back down to room air or even lower. It's the change that initiates the activation of something, in this case called hypoxia-inducible factor 1 alpha, which stimulates the body to make more blood vessels, increase nitric oxide production, good for the endothelium that you just described. So it's really about shaking it up. And I find that one of the most interesting metrics that we are all getting from our wearable devices is heart rate variability. And that is, in a sense, showing not the heart rate, but the way that the heart is able to change in subtle ways. It's a rhythm, beat to beat, in very minute ways, but it shows its adaptability and plasticity. And I think everything you've mentioned thus far will play out in terms of increasing or improving heart rate variability. So it becomes sort of a metric, in my opinion, of how much hormesis you are experiencing.
100%. So this whole idea is predicated on bioplasticity. And bioplasticity is essentially the biological equivalent of use it or lose it. And the more we stress our systems, the greater we build capacity. And the opposite is true. The less we stress, the more we lose capacity, which is why the lack of stress is increasing the risk of mental and physical illness. And there's such a phenomenon called sus-stress, which is inadequate stress. So our entire framework and rethinking of stress is we know there's distress or too much stress. And now we also understand that at the other end of the spectrum, sus-stress or inadequate stress is just as harmful. So what we want is this hormetic or Goldilocks, just right amount of stress that's the sweet spot. And with all these stressors, what we want to do is get to a point where we're past our comfort zone, just a little, where it's not overwhelming, we still feel safe.
And safe, good word.
Yes, and exactly, because if you are exposed to cold and it's not safe, you can get hypothermic.
Yeah, you don't want to harm yourself.
Exactly. And so you just want to get to that point where you're just a little uncomfortable and then followed by recovery. And that is the sweet spot. And what's happening at a cellular level is we've always thought of the stress response as something that happens in our autonomic nervous system. Most people think, oh, fight or flight. The reason I'm not doing well in this modern world is because my body thinks I'm fighting or running from a saber-toothed tiger.
It's always the saber-toothed tiger.
It's
always. There have had to be other things.
But that's the alarm system, the split-second response. What we understand now is that the stress response is happening at another level, the level of our cells. There's 7 cellular stress responses, and the time scale is different. So, after this abrupt exposure to the stressor for hours, days, and even a lifetime epigenetically, we are changing our cells. We are rewiring our bodies in ways that are telling us how to handle future stress better. And these cellular stress responses are doing what I call the 4 Rs. They're resisting damage from inflammation and antioxidants. They are repairing DNA and protein. They're recycling damaged parts of our cells through autophagy and doing some housekeeping. And they're recharging our cells by increasing our mitochondria. And that's why this concept of good stress exists, right? It's so different from the way we perceive the stress in our lives. Like, there's no question the chronic stress, the kind we're dealing with, is harmful, but there's also good stress. And the paradox really is that we need the good stress to build resilience to the chronic stressors that are in our life. And our goal really isn't to get rid of stress or to cure it out of our lives. Our goal is to understand the difference between the bad stress and the good stress and to learn how to optimize the stress in our life.
So that said, with everything that we've talked about, how do you incorporate that into your clinical practice when you're confronting a patient who has some challenging health or beginning to have some metabolic health issues, et cetera, and is living pretty much the cush life?
Well, I've been using these hormetic practices with my patients for years, and I practice them in my own life. So I love this question because within a very short time frame, like weeks to months, I've seen dramatic reversal and changes. So I'll start off by saying these are everyday things that we can all be doing. The idea of stress seems daunting, but it's not if it doesn't kill you or it has to kill you to make you stronger. Hormetic stressors shouldn't kill you. We're talking about everyday mild to moderate stressors. And it can be something as simple as adding 30 seconds of cold at the end of a warm shower, or taking a hot bath at night at a temperature between 102 to 104 degrees. It could be adding a plant food to your plate. I mean, only 1 out of 10 Americans right now is getting the recommended fruits and vegetables. So just add one more piece of fruit or vegetable. It could be as simple as just not eating after dinner and trying to eat aligned with your circadian biology. It could be as simple as sending an email that is meaningful, that takes you down a path of something that you believe in, aligns with what you want to do in this world, but it scares you, right? And that's kind of the healthy stress. And those are just simple things. And I just encourage people to really do an inventory of the stress in their life. And then we have to kind of see, okay, what's in the bad stress bucket? What's in the good stress bucket? And there's certainly things that everybody can do to remove things out of the bad stress bucket. But the piece that we also work on is how to add the good stress bucket, because sometimes people hit a roadblock, like they're stuck because you can be under a lot of emotional stress, but meditation may not work for you. Mindfulness may not work for you. You need a different set of tools because some people just have a busy mind. And hormetic stressors work through cross adaptation, meaning that you can use any one of these stressors to build resilience against the others because they work through synergistic and overlapping pathways. So, an alternate approach, if you have too much chronic stress in your life, is, well, introduce a physical stressor. Run up a flight of stairs, do just something that's vigorous activity, add a plant. These are just an alternate way of getting to that same endpoint, because I think we need a set of tools that works with our biology, the natural rhythm of our body, something that our ancestors have just grown to depend on. These are actually more sustainable and easier than fighting our tendencies to avoid the things in our modern world that we are actually inclined to want to seek.
You just said something interesting. That is the natural rhythm of our bodies. And, the rhythm connotes kind of to and fro. maybe sinusoidal, but the fact is there's an ongoing rhythmicity to all of our processes in homeostasis. But I don't think we really recognize it or feel that. Certainly chronobiology takes a look at that, but we really, I think have a tendency just to see things as monolithic and unchanging. And I think the more that we participate in life from that perspective, the worse it is for us. Again, because there's no change. And the change builds our resilience because we're going to be challenged. In fact, we are challenged. You mentioned the challenge to our DNA. We want to be able to have good reparative processes, but we are challenged as it relates to our cardiovascular function day in and day out. Hopefully, anyway. But the rhythmicity part of it, the rhythm of life, I think is a really important point that, that's something we should kind of close our eyes and experience.
And it's so much more natural for us to do things that just maintain that rhythm. I mean, this is why I think that we should all be adding the good stressors in our life. When you look at studies, they're so much easier to sustain and stick with because they are natural and wired in our DNA. And when people try to kind of balance, I always ask, well, what does that mean, right? So back to your example of the hyperbaric chamber, you can say that about all of the chemicals released from a stress response. If you look at cortisol, for example, what we want is to maintain the natural rhythm of cortisol, which is going to be higher in the morning and it's going to come down in the evening. For people who are trying to just lower cortisol, well, if you lower it in the morning, well, you're just not going to be as awake and alert. Your mind isn't going to think as sharp. That's not always what you want. What you want to do is enhance your natural biology. So, for example, if you do a high intensity interval workout, you are going to get a spike in your cortisol, but you need that spike to build the muscle that follows. Without the cortisol, you do not get the adaptation. You don't get the muscle building. And interestingly enough, after exercise, cortisol levels rest of the day are lower than baseline. Heart rate variability improves. Your blood pressure lowers. So we don't have to fear these spikes because these intermittent transient spikes are actually going to help us get to a baseline that is healthier, right? It's like saying avoid exercise because it raises your heart rate or it raises your blood pressure.
Or it
Well,
leads to inflammation.
yeah, when it's transient, our bodies know what to do with it. But this is such a key thing that this is the natural rhythm of how our body optimizes. And if we can maintain that rhythm or do things that reinforce that rhythm, we are better off.
Well, it gets back to where we started, and that is that these stressors are hormetic or positive. They're brief, intermittent, and followed by recovery. Those are your words. And it's as it relates to exercise, for example, it's obviously going to be intermittent and probably brief. I mean, when you think of a 24-hour day, and then we recover. And it's interesting that there was a move for quite some time amongst elite athletes to quell inflammation, the inflammation that was generated by exercise, using things like cold bath, etc. And it was found that some of the benefits from a cardiovascular perspective of exercise were blunted when those inflammatory cytokines, well, particularly interleukin 6, were blunted. So that there's we think of these inflammatory chemical cytokines. Well, those are bad. We don't want those, like IL-6 or interleukin 1 beta. But the reality is, through the lens of hormesis and what we've talked about today, what might the upside be? And now we're seeing that, yes, matter of fact, interleukin 6 is what activates AMP kinase, which is one of our goals of exercise. So to characterize, these chemicals as being bad, and they're induced by exercise or any stress for that matter, I think through the lens of what you've described today really allows us to reframe, that this is part of our homeostatic physiology, that things go up and go down. And again, it's that dynamism that allows us to be resilient.
Yeah, our body doesn't have a moral code.
I
There is
love that.
no, you know, it's not like cortisol bad, a different hormone good. These are it just is how our body's responding to our environment, right? Like we have a dopamine system that rewards us. It's that we want to just uh, kind of use our natural ability to stay in this rhythm. But these things aren't good or bad. And we really do have to ask the question of how do we optimize? And that's what we're really getting at here, right? And our bodies know what to do. I mean, truly, we just need to get out of the way and let our bodies heal.
I'm going to tell you right now, I'm going to take the quote, "Our body doesn't have a moral code." That is great because, again, we tend to label things. And once that label is on, it fully defines whatever it is we're talking about. Testosterone is a male hormone. Oh, that car shows a lot of testosterone, a muscle car. And progesterone, like it's only pro-gestation. And that cytokines are inflammatory mediators that are bad. So I love that. It's the labeling of these things gets us into trouble, especially it's hard to unwind from that kind of definition or how we perceive of these things in our minds after we study them.
And it takes us down a path where we're doing things that are actually not health promoting, but we think they are. Like you just said, like sometimes we're trying to blunt something that's natural. There's so many, for example, supplements that want to reduce your cortisol level. Well, if you're doing that right before a workout, you are going to blunt the gains from that workout. And I think that is such an important thing. You have to be so intentional anytime you are taking anything exogenously, whether it's a prescription drug or a supplement, because our body has been fine tuned. I mean, millions of years, these pathways have developed to know how to respond to different stimuli. And we're essentially trying to outsmart it, but we're not exactly being successful.
Yeah, the cortisol, blunting the cortisol elevation in the morning is often described by people as being a goal. And, you're absolutely right. From my perspective as a neurologist, we know that cortisol is fundamentally important for allowing hippocampal neurons to work. That higher levels of cortisol become neurotoxic. Dr. Robert Sapolsky made that very clear. But a low level, but higher above baseline that we see in the morning is really kind of fundamental for your brain's memory center. Thank you very much. So the idea of blunting it because, cortisol is bad and other things are good, that, I hear exactly what you're saying, that we've got to be a little bit more judicious in defining our goals as both consumers and as those who interface with those consumers in terms of what we think people should be doing for better health.
And personalizing it, right? Because there are going to be people
No
who
question.
are at a level of cortisol where it is harmful. So, from Dr. Sapolsky's work, we know the same hormone, cortisol, can, in a low, mild to moderate range, it can enhance synaptic plasticity. It can help the communication in our brain cells. And when it's at a very high level, it prunes them, right? So it's what's the Goldilocks sweet spot for you in terms of activating cortisol. And that's going to be different for you. It's going to be different for me and for anybody listening to us. So it's optimizing, but there's some personalization that has to happen. And some of that can be intuitive, right? Like, how do you feel after stress? If you feel exhausted, drained, burnt out, well, that was probably bad stress or chronic stress. If you feel energized, motivated, creative, then you have hit your sweet spot. That stress has helped to regenerate you.
What a great place to end our time together, right? That's so positive.
Yeah, I mean, I at the end of the day, I've been doing research in lifestyle-based medicine for a long time now. I've been doing research around hormesis and also the effects of implementing these changes, and I've been in clinical practice, and I can't say enough about how when we use these non-negotiables in our physiology, that we are using the most powerful medicine we have for building our health. And I firmly believe that each one of us has the potential to live a better life. We have to be willing to get uncomfortable in the service of increasing our human capability.
We have to be able to get uncomfortable in the service of creating. Tell me again.
We have to be willing to get uncomfortable in the service of increasing our human
Oh my gosh,
capability.
that's beautiful. Well, Dr. Bergquist, thank you for spending some time with us today. And I know this is going to be hugely successful. By the time everybody sees this podcast, this book will be available, probably even available now in pre-order. And I'm always grateful that I get these books on the front end, before anyone else. So that's great. That's one of the perks of the job. Thank you so very much for spending your time with us today. This was really, really incredibly important information for everybody.
Oh, thank you for having me and the opportunity to share this information.
Great. We'll talk to you soon. Bye bye. Well, what did we learn? We learned that living the cush life might not necessarily be what we should be doing if we want to live a longer and healthier life and become more disease resistant and becoming resilient. Again, the book is The Stress Paradox. I strongly recommend it. Dr. Bergquist's credentials are certainly quite significant in terms of being able in a position to write such a great book, not just in terms of her clinical practice, but in terms of the research that she's done, that she shared with us today. I'm Dr. David Perlmutter. Thank you again for joining us today on the Empowering Neurologist podcast. We will be back soon. Bye for now.